Hi everyone, today I'm joined by Colin Nelson from Hype Innovation that are based in Bonn. Hype Innovation are a software company that specialize in ideation processes. So today's talk will focus very much on the ideation phase, which is very important before moving along the innovation process into discovery and incubation, etc. So I'd like to welcome Colin to the call, who's actually Director of Strategic Consulting. He deals with a lot of clients that are using and not using software, but I think it would be very important today to get insights from how an ideation process needs to work in order to foster innovation. So Colin, welcome to the call, and can you give us a brief introduction to yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Jan, and a pleasure to speak with you today. So Hype Innovation are an idea and innovation management software company. We typically help organizations that are looking to tap into the collective insight of their companies, their employees, their suppliers, and also their customers, derive ideas from those groups to help support a whole range of innovation activities that exist within the enterprise. They could be very, very large corporates like a DHL or a Deutsche Telekom, or they could be very small organizations that just have 50 people in different locations, and it's helpful for them to come together to collaborate online. My role is on the people and process side of things, so I help with the culture change, the communications, establishing effective programs that are sustainable. So if we generate ideas, we can do so continuously over many years with increasing levels of value and innovation.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Colin. So let's get into some questions. Let's start off with what type of ideas do you guys work with? So when companies are using your software, do you see any trends in the type of ideas that companies are looking to generate?
Yeah, absolutely. And they group themselves into two very distinct buckets. So at one end of the scale, we have the efficiency or cost-based, process-based ideas. So we'll see particularly mature organizations doing an awful lot of cost reduction ideas. How do we make something cheaper? How do we make something faster? At the other end of the scale, we obviously have things that are much more product, service, business model innovation related. So I consider them to be the efficiency agenda and the growth agenda. Both of them have money at their heart, but essentially that's where the two extremes of the scale are. And of course, there are some areas between those two as well. So we'll look at things like continual improvement. We'll look at process innovation. We'll look at innovating the supply chain or the supplier models, a whole range of different areas. But primarily, we're talking about efficiency and growth.
Okay, and what about disruptive ideas?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So at the extreme end, obviously, we have radical or disruptive ideas, and organizations will proactively seek those. So that's an increasing area of our business. The techniques used to generate disruptive ideas are actually very little different to the techniques to generate cost-reducing ideas. But some of the mechanisms that go around that, of course, are a little bit different. But yeah, most organizations have an eye on, if they're not already, looking to try and find more breakthrough, disruptive, or radical ideas.
Okay, so when you're looking for these kinds of ideas, I guess it's important to define what sort of ideas are we looking for first, and then what's the next step? Where would these ideas normally come from? Is it open to anyone in the company to contribute, or are you also selecting which departments might be more appropriate to deliver on these kinds of ideas?
So the foundations for most organizations is something called an idea campaign. This is a structured way of generating ideas around a specific need. It's attached to a particular sponsor, somebody who needs to get something done. Ideas come from a selected community. That could be the entire enterprise. It could be a hand-picked group of people. It could be a combination of internal and external parties focused on that one common need, that common objective. There's an idea generation phase where people are encouraged to share their ideas around that core question, but also to collaborate on the ideas that are submitted. So we're not just interested in the ideas of individuals. What we want is for different people with different perspectives to build and collaborate and make the ideas of others better. And that's where a lot of the richness comes from. Stops us just focusing on fragments of ideas and developing a little bit more rounded concepts. And often the initial ideas that we see may not be the best, but once we've had a discussion about them, we've looked at them from different perspectives, we begin to see them develop and mature, and it's much easier for us to see where the quality really lies. At the end of that campaign submission phase, we have an evaluation process where a hand-picked group of people will assess the ideas that have been submitted. These are typically individuals that are part of the sponsors community, people that they trust. They'll make some qualitative and quantitative judgments on those ideas, and then perhaps forward them through for building of concepts or innovation projects, or they may well send them back to the sponsor and say, we'd like you to give a final approval on what's good. So they may well come from anywhere. We're typically talking about selected audiences. We don't normally ask every question to every individual, every employee. We want to be a bit more specific about that. But likewise, we need to find a balance. If we only ask the same people that we know for sure can answer a particular question, we typically don't find a lot of creativity. So we want to go a little bit wider in that group and find some deliberate diversity, people with different perspectives.
Right. I think that diversity is a key point, right? You often don't know where key contributions might end up coming from.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, you don't know where people may have worked previously in their careers, what other jobs they may well have had. What we find is that there are different personality types at play here. So some people are very strong at coming up with new ideas. Others are much stronger at telling you where the weak points may exist, or building it and developing it into a more rounded concept. Ideally, what we want to find is for people to play to their strengths. So irrespective of what their normal role in the company would be, play to their innovation role. And that way, we're getting different people to play to different strengths. We can develop a more rounded concept. And as you say, you don't always know where those ideas can come from. So we need to go wider than the traditional groups. And sometimes that does mean asking everybody, even if we know that most people won't respond.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about submitting ideas, having different audiences get involved. And I understand that Hype Innovation is, of course, primarily a software company. You're actually managing this process through a software. What's the correlation or balance between capturing these insights through a software or doing it face-to-face? Because one thing that the Academy is looking at is hosting innovation days to help encourage ideation and creative thoughts and sparring with diverse people. To create those initial sparks that then can lead into larger projects.
Sure. So I think it's important to understand when software has a role, when software has less of a role. If we know there's only 5 people that can potentially help us, putting them in a room and having a discussion is going to be the right answer. When it might be 50 people or 500 people or 500,000 people, of course, we can't put that kind of size group of people in a room. So the first instance where software usually comes into play is with regard to scale. So if the group of individuals that we want to have one conversation exist in too many different places or are too large, then obviously software has a role to play. The second piece of the puzzle is where are these people physically located and what are the time zones? For many organizations, they're operating in many different countries, and people are not free easily to move around and be in the same place. So if you're trying to collaborate between Helsinki and Japan, there's very little overlap time perhaps in time zones. Or perhaps you're in Germany and your colleagues are in California. How do you engage in one rich discussion relatively quickly without having to fly people around halfway around the world? And that's where, again, the software has a role to play. So we'll give people perhaps a week or 2 weeks to have that discussion as opposed to flying them in and putting them in a room. I think the third area where obviously it has a role is when the diversity exists beyond the group that we reasonably understand. So you made the point of not knowing necessarily where those ideas are going to come from. There are times when we simply need to reach out to a diverse group of people and go fishing and see what's out there based upon the challenge or the need that we have and see what we catch. That, in many cases, for many organizations, is the big benefit of using the software. Now, having said all of that, face-to-face still has an absolutely crucial role here. And in many organizations, they try to use a combination of face-to-face ideation techniques and online. So face-to-face, often when they're trying to work out what the problem needs to look like, and online when the scale, the diversity of people need to be brought together, and it sits beyond the scale of people we could reasonably fit in a room and get to work together well. One final part where the software really helps is retention of all the ideas and the comments that we generate. So often our clients will run these programs over many, many years. Nothing gets lost if it's captured in the software. So even when people are doing face-to-face ideation, often what they'll do is they'll have a PC in the room, they'll run a facilitated session and capture everything online, so it's then able to be searched and filtered upon by other parts of the organization at future dates. In many cases, ideas that we generate today are not necessarily going to be relevant for the immediate challenge, or a small portion may only be relevant for the immediate challenge, and many more may be relevant for us in future years. And we want to try and keep those in one place. So face-to-face has an absolutely crucial role, and absolutely is sometimes the best way of doing things. When the scale, the diversity, or the legacy data comes into play, that's where the software usually comes into its own.
I really like the final point you made there, Colin, that it's actually recorded. And I think this has another positive effect in that it actually encourages people to submit ideas, because they know it's being recorded and can potentially be used in the future. Whereas if that's not going to take place, a lot of people might be a little bit like, okay, well, maybe I don't need to speak about this or mention anything because nothing will happen anyway.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the software helps you, to a certain extent, build confidence and belief in the process. We can actually spell out for people what the next step is going to be. So if I understand what the next step will be, I'm much more likely to join in. And I think that it's helpful to have some rigor around the process that actually allows individuals to see, okay, if I submit my idea here, I understand it will be assessed, I understand if it's good, it will be forwarded through to this committee and eventually make it through to a business concept. That has a very significant bearing in overall participation, for sure.
Okay, so let's see if we can move into some stories or examples. I know you're under confidentiality with a lot of clients, but maybe there's one or two stories you could give us of more disruptive ideas that you have seen just beginning out with life as a small spark as a result of being invited into participating into a campaign.
Sure.
And it's actually managed to evolve and actually have a significant impact on the organization.
Absolutely. So disruption obviously is defined differently in different organizations. I think that's the first thing to say. So it's always within context. Sometimes we're looking for disruption simply because our market's going away. Sometimes we're looking for disruption because we just simply want to be more competitive, or we simply want to grow faster. And that tends to affect what sorts of ideas people look for and how they manifest themselves. If we look at something around the growth agenda for a second, I want to look at Casapellas. Casapellas are probably an organization relatively few people have heard of, but they actually have one of the best innovation rates per individual, per employee of any of our clients. It's an organization in Nicaragua that works in the automotive sector, and they had helped move their culture forward in terms of developing more and new innovative ideas by focusing initially on very incremental things. Once the organization got comfortable with incremental innovation, it started to stretch it into what we call more strategic innovation areas. And eventually, once it got comfortable there, started throwing some challenges in around disruption. And one idea that sticks in my mind for an organization in the automotive industry from Casapellas is that they identify from their employees an idea to take car servicing, put all of the equipment and materials that are involved in car servicing into a truck, and then allow individuals to have their car serviced from their home or their place of work. Now, in Nicaragua, that was not a service that you could get anywhere. In fact, actually, it's quite hard for me to get that service in the UK unless I really knew where I was looking for. But this is a mainstream dealer going out and disrupting the rest of the market. That came from an idea submitted as part of an idea campaign for looking for new sources of revenue. And I think that in terms of their measure of disruption, they look at the amount of growth it can sustain. And for them, that was substantial for something like that. Very, very significant growth curve, well beyond their existing growth levels. And it certainly disrupted that entire market. And that product, as I understand it, is now being put into production.
Interesting. So it's like a mobile garage that comes to you
Basically,
rather than
yeah.
you having to go to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually some of the early points I made are worth just lingering on for a second, because they accepted the fact that their culture wasn't necessarily ready to share ideas around disruptive principles just yet. So they had to take them on a journey to get them to the point of feeling comfortable around disruptive ideas or more radical ideas. And I think that this is a challenge for a lot of companies. When we know that our market's going to be disrupted, it's hard for us to necessarily get everybody in our organization to buy into the fact that we have a role to play in there. People tend to be uncomfortable with change, and so getting them to open their eyes to the fact that actually you have a role to helping us move forward is a tough one. If we look at, say, the Scandinavian pulp and paper business, there's a whole range of different organizations involved in that. That market is decreasing substantially, and they're having to disrupt to survive. So as an industry, what they're trying to do is look at new technologies, new ways of making use of their skills and their resources in order to be able to survive through what is a decreasing traditional
Mm.
market for themselves. Now, almost every pulp and paper organization in Scandinavia has a role to play here. But for the employee, for the person that works in the paper mill, that's quite painful, because you may not necessarily have a job at the end of this journey. So how do we get them involved in that process? So we have to be cognizant of our culture and the fact that we're going to have to take them down that path of making them feel more comfortable to open up about these sorts of topics.
Well, this is interesting because it leads me to another question now. Who is responsible for innovation?
It varies dramatically between company to company. Some organizations will say it's the CEO that's responsible. For others, it will say it's the chief innovation officer. Yet many companies don't have a chief innovation officer. I actually prefer a definition which makes it everybody's responsibility for innovation, where no matter what domain you're working within, you have a role to play. So if you're working on a production line, you can still make suggestions of how we can innovate and improve that process. If you are the chief executive, you can look for innovative ideas to change the business model. You can look for innovative ideas to reduce our cost base. Almost across the entire spectrum of those ideas that we talked about a moment ago, you have a role to play. Now, if you look at someone like Tesco's, and you want to talk to Tesco's, the big supermarket chain, and you ask them who's responsible for innovation, they'll say everybody. Everybody's involved in some way, shape, or form. Now, the reality is, to get to that position is hard. You have to do an awful lot of work on your culture and establishing good collaborative behaviors, and make sure that employees feel and understand that they have a role to play. That perhaps deals with the internal world. And I have to say, very few organizations probably have that as a comfortable position where everybody's responsible for innovation. But many, many are on that journey. If we look at the external world, who's responsible for innovation? Is it the supply chain group who interact with the key suppliers? And should they have a role to play? Well, absolutely. But what's the role for the supplier? What's the role for the customer? They're not really responsible for innovation, but in many cases they have a vested interest in innovation. So if you're the company, if you're the corporation, you have to make it possible for them to help you innovate. They're not responsible for your innovation, but it is your responsibility to make it possible for them to help you.
Very good point. So including outside partners, customers, this is basically helping crowdsource your innovation, right?
Potentially, yes. If you look at someone like Mattel, the toy manufacturer, an awful lot of their innovations come from external inventors. And what they do is they put that process online, and they invite you, if you're you're an inventor of toys, to submit your idea to Mattel. And they will have a commercial agreement that wraps around that, so that if your idea is good, IP is nice and clear, revenue shares are nice and clear, and there's a very structured process for Mattel to go and commercialize your idea, which does not disillusion you, which makes you get some benefit out, makes sure you get some benefit out of that, and it's a nice sustainable process. But actually reaching out to their network, increasing the scale of that, bringing those ideas in. It's not the responsibility of the innovator or the inventor for Mattel's innovation, but it is a responsibility for Mattel to make it possible for those individuals to give them the ideas that they have. And I think that they're doing a really great job at that.
Right, okay. So I have another question which is focused on the idea itself. So I believe ideas are very fragile because they actually evolve over time, right? Anyone starting a new business or a new project, the next day you wake up, your priorities have slightly changed. The overall concept has slightly changed. And I think this creates a problem when you are communicating ideas to management. Often management hear about an idea in the very early stage. It's not yet really proven. There's maybe not so much evidence yet that this is really a good idea. And there's a tendency that the idea then gets shot down, although it has potentially the origins of a very good idea if it were allowed to be evolved further in the right way. What have you seen in terms of at what stage can you begin to judge that an idea is actually a good idea and you're onto something here, and that it is therefore worthwhile investing more resources in developing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we see is that organizations need to follow a very structured approach to this to ensure that organizations don't kill ideas too early, but equally create a process that is manageable. If we simply allow the organization to bombard us with ideas that are completely scattergun all over the map, yes, of course, a lot of ideas are going to be killed or ignored or pushed onto a shelf before they've had a chance to develop. This is where the sort of campaign-based or the facilitated workshop-based ideation sessions really come into their own. If you start off with the need and the individual with the need, so that manager or that director or that VP only asks the questions for which they're looking for ideas, what we do is we actually generate a lot less content, and the quality, of course, goes up because we're asking a very specific question. It's easier for organizations and the employees of that organization to engage in that specific question. So what we get is a richer source of ideas. So instead of us saying, okay, at any point in time you can offer us any idea you like, what we do is we treat it like a tap. So we're going to turn it on and turn it off, and turn it on and turn it off. And each time we do that, we're going to get an answer to a very specific question. So we only ask the innovative questions for where we want the innovative ideas. Now, if you're that sponsor, the person responsibility for a particular area or a particular problem or a need, you're absolutely committed to looking and implementing the best ideas. That's why you've put the energy into reaching out to the organization and getting them involved. So ideas typically get killed only if they're completely far away from the subject. And in many cases, we get much higher quality submissions, so that process works better. Second thing to bear in mind is we need to evaluate ideas effectively in an efficient way. If we generate, like Peugeot did with their very first idea campaign, 1,300 ideas, it's very difficult to process all of those. That's a lot of content to get through, especially if each of those ideas maybe has, on average, 2 or 3 comments on it, which, of course, you've got to look at. So scale and getting too many ideas can equally be a problem. Being focused about what your need is going to help you get a process that's going to be effective. So I'm going to evaluate the content, and typically that means getting 4 or 5 people together, looking at the best of the best content, making some judgments on that, and then only taking a very small selection of what's been submitted through to investigation. So it's about trying to manage the resources in an efficient way, accepting the fact that too much scale at the front end is going to be damaging back further down the process and getting quality instead of too much diversity. If you need ideas in 5 different buckets, ask 5 different questions, don't ask one. Making sure we have an evaluation process that focuses on assessing the potential of an idea, not necessarily how it exists now, before it actually goes into, say, a proof of concept or an investigation phase.
Okay, so in summary, you basically believe we need to be very systematic and focused in how we get ideas and how we evaluate them. That's one side of the equation. What about, it's never really a good idea until it's executed, right? Execution is 95% of the equation. So do you believe that certain people should be trained and have maybe more freedom to run with some of these ideas that have been evaluated and so that they can actually now apply a systematic process to executing and evolving that idea?
Absolutely, and the easiest way to explain that is to look at the skill sets. Anybody can have an idea, but to take an idea and put it into action requires a very specific set of skills. You need to understand how the organization approves money. You need to be able to write business cases, perhaps. You may need to develop proof of concepts. You may need to be able to go and sell that idea to others in the organization and maybe third parties as well before we're going to make substantial investments in it. You may need to take beta versions of it to market and see what kind of insights you get. All of those skill sets sit completely differently to the person with the idea, who could be anywhere in the organization and have potentially no capacity at all to put that into production. Likewise, the C-suite of the organization or the management group that may eventually become to own that idea may also not have the skills to put these things into production. So it's about getting the right people with the right skills in the right part of that process, and that typically is in that sort of concepting, innovation, project phase of taking an initial fragment generated perhaps by the crowd or the external world, taking it through whatever process is appropriate for you. That may be phasing gate, it may be business cases, whatever it is, in order to get it to a point of production. So having the right people with the right skills playing the right role in the right part of the process is absolutely vital for sure.
Okay, great. Colin, to close off, what would be your final piece of advice to people that are, or companies that are considering to do more with innovation and they know they need to start with the ideation phase? How can they get involved?
So firstly, start somewhere. A lot of companies may well fear, or individuals may fear, that they're not ready for ideation, they're not ready to generate ideas. The reality is you're never ready. There's no perfect scenario. You've got to try and find areas where you can benefit. So you may not necessarily be ready for disruptive innovation or even strategic innovation, but find me a company that doesn't want to save money. Saving money using idea crowdsourcing type techniques is not that difficult. There are lots of examples out there of how organizations can do that. I remember seeing DHL a couple of years ago who have generated substantial savings by simply involving their employees in the cost saving process. So most people understand that, okay, it takes a team of individuals to come up with a good idea. So let's give them the capability to actually generate those ideas, be that in brainstorming sessions or online. Let's start somewhere around a business need that we have today. And slowly but surely what we'll do is we'll establish the good behaviors and the beginning to see the culture develop that we want to see in terms of sharing and also sort of collaboration, which means that over time we can begin to develop, like Casapellas did, into an area where we can get more disruptive and more adventurous. That may take you a while, but starting is the key thing. Get the organization used to sharing and collaborating, and then we can use that capability and those behaviors on all kinds of different things.
All right, great. Get started and then see how it grows. So Colin, thank you so much for joining us. Our viewers, like always, are able to get in contact with you directly at the end of this video. So thanks again for your time and for the advice, which was very clear and very much to the point. Thank you for that.